At my son's wedding, joy should have filled the air. Instead, my daughter-in-law pointed at me, sneering, "You don't belong here." Laughter rippled through the crowd as I stood frozen, humiliated in front of everyone. Guests avoided my eyes, some whispering, others grinning at my pain. But deep inside, I wasn't broken. I had one powerful move left, a single phone call that would turn this wedding into something no one could ever forget. Before I continue, drop your country and the time you're watching this in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more shocking family stories that will leave you speechless. The morning of my son's wedding should have been filled with pride and excitement. I had laid out my best navy blue suit the night before, polished my shoes until they shone, and carefully tucked a small framed family photo into my inside pocket. It wasn't just a wedding to me. It was supposed to be the day our family grew, the day my son brought a new life partner into our circle. I imagined smiling in the family photos, laughing during the toasts, and finally feeling like my son had everything he ever dreamed of. But even as I adjusted my tie in the mirror, something weighed heavy on my heart. My future daughter-in-law had never truly accepted me. From the very first meeting, she had treated me like an inconvenience rather than a father figure. When I offered her advice about careers, she called me old-fashioned. When I tried to bond with her, she gave me cold, dismissive smiles. She never said it outright, but her eyes always held a flicker of disdain. My son, caught between love and loyalty, often brushed it off. "Dad, don't take it personally," he would say. "She's just stressed. She's not like this all the time." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that her sharpness was temporary, that marriage would soften the edges and bring us together. But deep down I felt an ache of dread. That morning, as sunlight poured through the window, I looked at the photo in my pocket, a picture of me holding my son when he was a little boy. Back then, his hand gripped mine tightly, his trust in me unshakable. I whispered to the picture, almost like a prayer, "Please let today be good." When I arrived at the wedding venue, the grand hall was buzzing with excitement. The chandeliers glittered like 1,000 stars, and every table overflowed with flowers. Relatives I hadn't seen in years greeted me with polite nods, though some avoided my gaze, whispering in hushed tones. I could feel the undercurrent of tension, subtle but undeniable. It was as if they too sensed something was brewing beneath the surface of the celebration. The ceremony itself was beautiful. My son looked dashing in his tuxedo, and my daughter-in-law walked down the aisle with elegance that turned heads. Applause echoed, vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers. Everyone clapped and cheered as they were pronounced husband and wife. I smiled too, for my son's sake, but in my chest the unease only grew heavier. I tried to silence the thoughts, telling myself, this is their day. Don't ruin it with doubts. But even as I joined the line to congratulate them, I noticed the way the bride's eyes hardened when she saw me approach. Her smile faltered just for a second, but enough for me to know. Whatever mask she was wearing, it was thin and fragile, and it was only a matter of time before it cracked in front of everyone. After the ceremony ended, the celebration moved into the reception hall, where music filled the air, and glasses of champagne sparkled under the lights. The grand chandeliers illuminated the room, reflecting on sequined dresses and polished shoes, as laughter echoed from table to table. I walked in quietly, trying to blend into the sea of guests. Everyone seemed so carefree, chatting and posing for photos, but inside me a knot of unease was tightening. The hall itself was magnificent, tall ceilings, walls lined with roses, and tables draped in white silk. Platters of food were being carried around by waiters, and the band played a soft melody as guests mingled. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, telling myself that maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the bride would show me a little warmth, now that the tension of the ceremony was over. But I didn't have to wait long before the truth revealed itself. As families gathered around for pictures, I stood to the side waiting patiently. I didn't want to push myself forward. I wanted to give the newlyweds their moment. When the photographer called for the immediate family photo, I smiled, adjusted my jacket, and began to step forward. My son's eyes met mine briefly, and for a second, I thought he was relieved to see me join. That relief didn't last. The bride turned her head sharply, her face still holding the mask of a smile for the crowd, but her voice cut like glass. "No, not him," she said, pointing at me. The photographer hesitated, lowering the camera. The guests around us froze, the laughter fading as everyone turned their eyes toward me. For a moment I thought I had misheard, but then she said it again, louder this time. "I don't want him in our pictures." Her words rang out across the hall, sharp and undeniable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few relatives coughed uncomfortably. Others exchanged looks of disbelief. My son stood stiffly at her side, torn between the woman he had just married and the father who had raised him. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but quickly shut it again, his jaw tightening as he turned away. I froze in place, my heart hammering. It felt as though the floor had opened beneath me. My entire body went hot, then cold. The sting of humiliation seared into my chest as dozens of eyes bore down on me. I could hear whispers around me, some muffled laughter, and it all blended into one deafening roar inside my head. The photographer shifted awkwardly, waiting for someone to clarify, but the bride's cold eyes locked onto mine, daring me to defy her. My lips pressed into a thin line. I wanted to scream, to demand respect, to remind her who I was as the father of the groom, the man who had worked his whole life to see this day. But instead I stood there, paralyzed by shock, with the weight of 100 judgments crushing me. Finally, the photographer raised the camera again and began taking pictures without me. Click after click, the flashes went off, capturing smiles and embraces, a family portrait that had deliberately erased me. I slowly stepped back, my vision blurring, my throat tight. My hands shook, but I clasped them behind my back, forcing myself to keep my dignity. Every second of that moment etched itself deep into my memory. This wasn't just rejection. This was humiliation crafted to wound, a message broadcasted to everyone. You don't belong here. I swallowed hard, blinking away the burn in my eyes. And that was when the seed of something dangerous planted itself inside me. If she believed she could erase me from my own son's life, she had no idea how wrong she was. I stepped back slowly, my shoes clicking softly against the polished marble floor. Around me the air was thick, heavy, suffocating with whispers and half-hidden smirks. It was as if the world had tilted, leaving me off balance, as though I had stumbled into a nightmare where my presence was no longer welcome. I stood near an empty table, clutching the edge of the chair for support as I tried to steady my breathing. I had endured plenty of hardships in my life, but never had I felt so invisible, so unwanted and so deliberately erased. I wasn't just being left out of a photograph, I was being erased from a legacy, stripped from a family moment that should have belonged to me as much as it belonged to them. Across the room, the photographer continued snapping away, the bride beaming with perfect poise, her arm wrapped possessively around my son's. Every smile from her felt sharper than a knife, every flash of the camera, a hammer driving the nail of my exclusion deeper into my heart. My son glanced toward me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Guilt? Regret? Or was it silent agreement with her? He quickly looked away, and that single gesture hurt more than all the whispers combined. I overheard murmurs from the guests. Did you hear what she said? She told him not to be in the picture. Why would she do that? Some were shocked, others amused, and a few clearly enjoyed the scandal. Nothing spreads faster at a wedding than drama, and I had just been made the centerpiece. One elderly relative, a cousin I barely knew, approached me cautiously. "Are you all right?" she whispered. Her pity made my stomach churn. I didn't want pity. I wanted respect. I wanted to be treated like the father who had raised his son, the man who had sacrificed nights, weekends, and dreams, so that this very moment could happen. Instead, I was the man being whispered about like a stain on the carpet. The bride's laughter rang out suddenly, a high, victorious sound that cut through the music. She looked over her shoulder at me, her eyes cold and gleaming as though she was daring me to react, daring me to cause a scene. Her hand tightened around my son's arm, pulling him closer to her as if to make it clear. He's mine now, not yours. My chest tightened, rage simmering beneath the humiliation. But I didn't move. I didn't storm out. I didn't shout. Instead, I let the silence settle around me like a cloak. Because while everyone thought I had been defeated, I knew something they didn't. I still had power. Even if they couldn't see it yet, I turned away from the crowd and took a slow breath, forcing my expression into something calm, even dignified. My trembling hands finally stilled as an idea formed in my mind. sharp, dangerous, and undeniable. They had taken my pride, but I would remind them, in no uncertain terms, who I truly was, and it would start with a single phone call. I walked slowly toward the back of the hall, away from the lights and the laughter. Every step echoed in my chest like a drumbeat, steady but heavy. My face was calm, but inside me a storm was tearing everything apart. For years I had taught my son about dignity, loyalty, and family, and now on the most important day of his life, those very values were being spat upon in front of me. I stood near a long table draped in white linen, half-empty glasses glittering under the chandeliers. My hands traced the edge of the fabric, steadying myself. In the distance, the bride leaned in close to my son, whispering in his ear, her lips curling in that same smug smile that had just humiliated me in front of everyone. And my son, he didn't even flinch. He didn't defend me. He didn't say a word. That silence from him cut deeper than her words ever could. It wasn't just that she had humiliated me. It was that he had allowed it. Memories flashed in my mind. The nights I worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. The time I skipped my own medical treatment so he could have new shoes for school. The graduation ceremony where I stood in the back, clapping until my hands went numb. Tears in my eyes because I had finally seen him succeed. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dream I gave up, all of it had led to this moment. And now all of it felt worthless. But as the bitterness rose in my throat, so did something else, clarity. I realized that I could stay silent, pretend it didn't matter, and let them win. Or I could remind them, not with screaming or begging, but with something far more powerful, action. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and felt the weight of my phone. Cold, solid, and waiting. My thumb hovered over the screen as possibilities flickered through my mind. There were people I could call. People who owed me favors. People who still remembered who I was and what I had built long before my son and his bride thought they could erase me. The thought steadied me. My humiliation would not end me. It would ignite me. I turned slightly, watching the crowd from the corner of my eye. They laughed, drank, and danced, oblivious to the storm about to break. The bride threw her head back, laughing at some comment from her friends, and for the briefest second, her gaze locked with mine. She saw the phone in my hand and her smile faltered. Just for a moment, good. She should be nervous because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I took a deep breath, raised the phone, and began to dial. Each number pressed felt like a drumbeat of justice, each tone echoing louder in my ears. I didn't rush. I wanted her, no, I wanted all of them to see it, to feel the tension building, to know that something was coming. And as the call began to connect, I straightened my shoulders and walked back toward the center of the hall. Not defeated, not broken, but ready. The bride thought she had won when she humiliated me. She thought she had erased me, but tonight she would learn the truth. I was far from finished. The phone rang only once before it was picked up. A deep, steady voice answered on the other end. I didn't even need to say my name. He recognized the sound of my breathing instantly. "Is it time?" the voice asked. For a moment I didn't reply. My eyes stayed locked on the bride across the hall. She had stopped laughing now. Her smile was gone, her hand clenched around her glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. My son looked confused, glancing between us, not yet realizing the silent war unfolding right in front of him. "Yes," I finally said, my voice calm, almost quiet. "It's time." The man on the other end didn't question me. He didn't ask why. He simply said, "Consider it done." And the line went dead. I slid the phone back into my pocket, my heartbeat steady, my face unreadable. Around me, the wedding continued. Music playing, waiters moving in and out with trays, guests laughing over champagne. But in my mind, everything had shifted. The moment that call ended, the balance of power in this room tilted. Because while they saw me as the humiliated father pushed aside, I knew something they didn't. I had built connections that ran deeper than family blood. I had helped people, lifted them when they were drowning, stood by them when nobody else would. And in return, they stood ready for me, even years later, even now. I leaned back against the table, my eyes never leaving the bride. She whispered something to her bridesmaids, her lips tight, her shoulders stiff. She knew. She didn't know what I had done, but she knew it was something. Fear flickered in her eyes for the first time that night, and I savored it like a fine drink. My son approached me hesitantly, his steps slow, as if he were walking on broken glass. "Dad," he said softly, "what are you doing? Why are you making a scene?" I laughed, a small dry laugh. "Making a scene?" I repeated, keeping my voice low. "Son, you haven't seen anything yet." His brows furrowed, confusion clouding his face. He reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped away, leaving his hand hanging in the air. I wanted him to feel it. The distance between us. The weight of his choice to stand by her instead of me. The bride's father moved toward me then, puffed up with false bravado, his chest out, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Maybe you should leave," he sneered, "before you embarrass yourself even more." I turned my head slowly to look at him, and in that single moment he faltered. My eyes met his, cold and steady, and he realized something was wrong. I wasn't angry. I wasn't broken. I was calm. Too calm. I gave him a faint smile. "Embarrass myself?" I said, my tone measured. "No. I think embarrassment is about to change sides." As if on cue, the first sign appeared. A waiter walked briskly into the hall, his expression tense, whispering something into the wedding planner's ear. Her face blanched. She glanced at the bride, then at me, and hurried out again. Another guest's phone buzzed. They glanced at the screen, their eyes widening before they whispered to the person beside them. A ripple of unease began to spread across the room like cracks in glass. The bride tried to maintain her composure, but her hands betrayed her, trembling as she set her glass down too hard on the table. My son turned from her to me, panic starting to show. "Dad, what did you do?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because the first domino had already fallen, and I knew the rest would follow. The first ripple had spread, but soon it grew into a wave. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, murmurs buzzing low through the hall like a hive of unsettled bees. The bride's father shot a glance toward the entrance, his face twitching with unease, while the bride's mother clutched her pearls so tightly her knuckles turned white. The music faltered for a moment, the band exchanging worried glances as if they too sensed the shift in atmosphere. A strange tension settled over the room, not loud, not visible, but heavy. Like the pressure in the air before a storm, I stayed rooted in place, hands folded neatly in front of me, calm as a man watching chess pieces move exactly as he had planned. The bride's eyes darted toward me again, then to the doorway. She whispered something harshly to her bridesmaid, who rushed out into the corridor. My son's confusion grew with every passing second. He wanted to demand answers, I could see it, but something in my expression silenced him. Then it happened. The wedding planner burst back into the hall, her face pale, sweat dotting her forehead. She whispered something urgently to the bride, and whatever those words were, they struck her like a blow. Color drained from her cheeks, and she swayed slightly, as if her body could no longer bear the weight of the night. She grabbed her new husband, my son, by the arm and pulled him aside. "We need to talk now," he frowned. "What is it?" "Not here," she hissed. "Outside immediately," but my son didn't move. His eyes locked on mine, silently pleading. He wanted to believe I was bluffing, that I hadn't done anything. But the fear spreading across the bride's face told him otherwise, and then the whispers began. From one table to another, hushed voices spread like fire. Phones lit up, screens glowing with texts and notifications, until almost half the guests were staring at their devices in disbelief. I caught snippets, gasps, muttered curses, words like unbelievable and disgrace. The bride tried to smile, tried to keep her composure, but the cracks were showing. Her mascara smudged at the corners of her eyes as she forced out a laugh that no longer carried. She tugged my son toward the exit again, but this time he pulled back. "What's going on?" he demanded, louder now. The music stopped completely, the band dropping their instruments, attention fixed on the couple at the center of the storm. The bride's father stormed over, gripping his daughter's shoulder. "We'll handle this," he barked, but his voice quivered with panic. His wife tugged at his sleeve, whispering urgently, "It's too late. They all know. They've already seen it." "Seen what?" My son's eyes darted between them, then back at me, suspicion rising. He opened his mouth to ask, but a loud crash cut through the air. A tray of glasses slipped from a waiter's hands, shattering across the floor. It wasn't an accident. His eyes were fixed on his phone, disbelief written across his face. "Is this true?" he muttered, loud enough for a nearby table to hear, and just like that the whispers exploded into voices. Guests stood up, chairs screeching against the floor, phones flashing as they pulled up the same shocking news that had spread like wildfire. The bride's name was on every screen. Her face, her reputation, her secrets, all laid bare in front of everyone she had tried to impress. Her head whipped toward me, eyes blazing with desperation. "What did you do?" she spat. Her voice cracking, I didn't move, didn't blink. I simply tilted my head slightly, as though curious to see how she would handle the unraveling of her perfect world. My son's voice trembled. "Is this true?" he asked her quietly, his hand slipping from hers. She froze, caught like a deer in headlights, unable to answer, and in that silence is that sharp, cutting silence. The wedding turned from celebration to spectacle. The dominoes had fallen, and now there was no stopping the collapse. The ballroom, once filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses, had descended into a storm of whispers and chaos. Guests were standing now, no longer content to quietly murmur. They wanted answers. Phones lit up the hall like torches in a riot, each screen carrying the same damning revelation that had spread faster than wildfire. The bride's face was ghostly pale, her lips trembling as she tried to form words. But every attempt at speech died in her throat. Her bridesmaids hovered close, as if shielding her from invisible arrows, but even they glanced uneasily at their phones. The truth was too loud, too public, too undeniable. Her father tried to take control, slamming his hand on a nearby table so hard that silverware rattled. "Enough!" he barked, his voice booming over the noise. "This is a private matter. Everyone sit down." But his authority had already crumbled. Nobody obeyed. Instead, one of the guests, a family friend, her voice thick with shock, stood and shouted, "Is it true? Did she really do this?" The bride's mother whimpered, pressing her handkerchief to her face, while her father snapped, "Silence!" His face was red, veins bulging, but his fury only fueled the room further. My son looked between them, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "What are they talking about?" he demanded, his voice louder now, edged with anger. He turned sharply to his wife. Tell me they're lying." She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face as she stammered, It's not what it looks like." The crowd roared with disbelief. People leaned over tables, showing one another their screens, gasping and shaking their heads. Every second, more phones lit up. Every second, the shame deepened. The bride's father lunged toward me, his finger jabbing the air. "You did this," he shouted, spit flying from his mouth. "You're trying to destroy us." I didn't flinch. My expression stayed steady, calm, almost indifferent. "No," I replied evenly, my voice cutting through the uproar like a blade. "I didn't destroy anything." The truth did. A silence fell, not complete but heavy enough that the bride's labored breathing could be heard across the room. She tried again to defend herself, but her words were drowned out by a sudden voice from the back. One of the guests, a man I vaguely recognized from the community, called out, "I knew it." I always suspected. The hall erupted again, half shouts of outrage, half stunned disbelief. The bride's carefully built image, the sweet, perfect daughter-in-law, the beautiful bride, was crumbling before her very eyes. And I stood there, watching it unravel like a thread pulled loose from fine fabric. My son staggered backward, shaking his head. No, this can't be true," he muttered, his voice breaking. He turned to me, desperate, as if hoping I would tell him it was a lie. But I gave him nothing. No comfort, no denial, because he needed to see it for himself. He needed to understand that the woman he had defended so fiercely, the woman he had chosen over his own blood, was not who she pretended to be. The bride suddenly screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that silenced the crowd for an instant. "Stop looking at me," she cried, her mascara streaking down her cheeks as she clutched her dress like it might hold her together. "This isn't fair. You don't understand." But her words only deepened the whispers, sharpened the judgment. Her father pulled her close, his arm tight around her shoulders, his eyes filled with rage as he glared at me. "We'll fix this," he muttered fiercely to her, but his voice carried just enough that those nearby could hear. "We'll bury it just like before." That last phrase, "just like before," did not go unnoticed. Gasps rippled once more through the room. People exchanged looks of horror, realizing this wasn't the first time the family had tried to hide something. My son's face hardened. His jaw clenched, his shoulders stiffened, and for the first time he turned away from his bride and toward me. His eyes were searching, desperate for direction, but I remained silent, because some truths don't need to be spoken aloud. They reveal themselves in the cracks, in the chaos, in the desperate screams of those who thought they could keep their sins buried forever. The bride collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably, her veil slipping off as her bridesmaids struggled to comfort her. Her father barked orders, her mother wept openly, and my son stood frozen between two worlds, the family he thought he was building, and the father he had cast aside. And still, the night was far from over. The air inside the ballroom had grown suffocating. What was supposed to be the happiest night of my son's life had twisted into a circus of shame, and every guest was a witness. The walls seemed to vibrate with whispers, with the incessant pinging of phones as the news spread beyond the hall and into the wider world. The bride sat hunched in her chair, her veil torn, makeup streaking like war paint across her face. Her bridesmaids whispered frantically around her, but their words couldn't pierce through her sobs. Her hands shook violently, clutching at the fabric of her gown as if the satin itself could protect her from the storm that was closing in. Her father hadn't stopped pacing, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. Every so often his gaze snapped to me, filled with venom, but he didn't approach again. He knew, deep down, that nothing he could say would stop what was already in motion. His power, his influence, his money, none of it could smother the truth this time. And her mother was unraveling. She had slumped into a chair, her pearls askew, whispering prayers under her breath. She rocked slightly, eyes unfocused as though she had already accepted defeat. Meanwhile, my son stood in the middle of it all, trapped in the eye of the hurricane. His face was pale, his lips pressed tightly together, his hands clenched into fists. Every now and then he would open his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. He was frozen, not by shock, but by betrayal. Finally, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he turned toward his bride. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice low but steady. Her sobbing grew louder. She tried to reach for him, but he stepped back. "Don't touch me," he warned, his tone sharper now. "Just tell me. Is it true?" The entire room went still. Guests leaned in, holding their breath, waiting for her answer. Phones lowered, whispers faded. All that remained was her sobs, and his question hanging in the air like a blade. The bride choked on her words, shaking her head violently. It's not like that," she stammered. "They twisted everything. It's lies. All lies." But her defense was weak, trembling, unconvincing. Nobody believed her. And then, like a match-striking flame, a new voice broke through. One of the guests, a woman I didn't recognize, stood abruptly. "Lies?" she repeated, her voice dripping with fury. She held up her phone, her screen glowing brightly. "Then explain this." She read aloud the headline, her voice cutting through the silence. "Bride's hidden scandal exposed, shocking details revealed on wedding day." Gasps filled the hall. A wave of horrified murmurs rippled again, stronger this time, fueled by undeniable evidence. The bride screamed, lurching forward, trying to snatch the phone from the woman's hand. "Stop it, you don't know anything," she wailed, but the guests recoiled from her like she was diseased. Her father grabbed her arm, pulling her back into the chair. His face was twisted in rage and fear, but his voice trembled as he hissed in her ear. "You promised this would never come out." Those words, though whispered, carried just far enough. The crowd erupted again, voices rising in disgust. The bride buried her face in her hands, her sobs turning into wails, while my son staggered back a step, as though the floor itself had betrayed him. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the realization sink into his eyes. The father he had dismissed, insulted, pushed aside, had stood silently as the truth unfolded, and in that moment he finally understood. The hall was chaos now. Some guests shouted for answers, others whispered gleefully, already planning how they'd retell this scandal tomorrow. The band had long since stopped playing. The waiters hovered helplessly at the edges, and the wedding planner looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Through it all, I remained silent, calm watching, because the moment of collapse was near. The bride's carefully constructed world had cracked and splintered. But soon, very soon, it would shatter completely, and that shattering would be the climax. The ballroom was no longer a wedding hall. It had become an arena, an unforgiving stage where every secret, every lie, and every false smile was being ripped into the open. The chandeliers glimmered above, but their light only seemed to highlight the shame etched across the bride's tear-streaked face. My son stood rigid in the center, his fists clenched, his jaw locked. He had asked her for the truth, begged for even a shred of honesty, but all she had given him were excuses and denial. His eyes darted to me again, searching for clarity, but I offered none. This was her battle to lose, and lose it she would. The guests had lost any pretense of politeness. They no longer whispered. They shouted, "Is it true? How long has this been going on?" She lied to everyone. The bride's father roared over the noise, "Enough! Everyone sit down before I have you all removed." But his authority, once untouchable, was gone. His words bounced uselessly against the crowd, who had tasted blood and weren't letting go. Then the breaking point came. One of the groomsmen, a tall man with a stiff posture and nervous eyes, stepped forward. His voice shook as he spoke, but his words cut through the chaos like a knife. "I can't stay quiet anymore," he said. The hall froze. He looked at the bride, shame flickering in his gaze. "You told me this would never come out, that nobody would ever know." Gasps echoed like gunshots. The bride's head snapped up, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Stop!" she shrieked, her voice hoarse. "Don't you dare!" But it was too late. The crowd erupted into a frenzy. Dozens of phones raised higher now, desperate to capture every word, every second of the unfolding disaster. My son stumbled back, shaking his head in disbelief. His eyes locked onto the groomsman, then back to his bride. "What is he talking about?" he demanded, his voice raw with hurt. The groomsman swallowed hard, his hands trembling. She lied to you. To all of us. Don't say it," the bride screamed, lunging forward, her bridesmaids barely managing to restrain her. Her veil tore completely free, fluttering to the ground like a white flag of surrender. But the damage was already done. The groomsman's unfinished confession was enough to confirm what everyone already suspected. There was a darkness in her past, one she had tried desperately to hide. One her family had buried with money and influence. And now, in the worst possible moment, it had clawed its way to the surface. My son's face crumpled. His voice cracked as he whispered, "How could you?" His hands shook as he stepped away, distancing himself not just physically but emotionally. The bond of trust shattered in front of everyone. The bride sobbed uncontrollably, collapsing to the floor, her gown spreading around her like a broken crown. Her father barked orders to security, to the planner, to anyone who would listen, but nobody moved. Nobody wanted to protect them anymore. The guests were too hungry for the truth, too eager to see the mighty fall. Even the band, forgotten in the corner, watched with wide eyes, their instruments silent in their hands. The bride's mother wailed openly, clutching her daughter as though her arms could shield her from the storm. But the storm wasn't coming. It was already here, and I stood silently steady, watching the destruction unfold exactly as I knew it would, because this wasn't just humiliation. It was justice, and it was only the beginning. The ballroom was unrecognizable now, no longer draped in celebration but stained in betrayal. Every guest had become a judge, jury, and executioner, and the bride stood trembling before them, her perfect image crumbling piece by piece. Her father, red with rage, tried to silence the crowd again. "This wedding is over. Everyone out," he thundered, but not a single soul moved. Phones hovered higher, flashes popping, recording every second of the implosion he could no longer contain. His empire of respect was collapsing right before his eyes. My son's chest rose and fell in heavy breaths, his face pale. He turned toward the groomsmen again, demanding answers, his voice low but dangerous. "Tell me everything. Right now." The groomsman's eyes darted around the room, guilt pressing down on him like a stone. He stammered, She wasn't honest about who she was before. There were things she swore no one could ever know. Things her family paid to bury." The bride let out a guttural scream, her voice echoing against the ballroom walls. She lunged forward, her manicured nails clawing at his suit, but he shoved her off with a look of pure disgust. "She used me," he shouted now, no longer trembling. "She used me to cover up her mess, and Enough." her father bellowed, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. But his interruption was useless. The words were out, hanging heavy in the air, impossible to retract. Gasps rippled across the crowd like shockwaves. Some guests recoiled in horror, others sneered in judgment, and many smirked with cruel satisfaction. Everyone had come expecting a glamorous night, and instead, they had been handed a scandal that would live on in whispers and headlines. The bride fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, smearing her makeup until her face looked ghostly, almost unrecognizable. Her tiara slipped sideways, no longer a crown but a mocking reminder of what she had lost. Her mother knelt beside her, stroking her hair, begging her to calm down. "Please, sweetheart, stop. We can fix this. We can—" But she couldn't fix it. No one could. The groomsman's words had cracked the facade wide open, and now the flood poured out. Other whispers began surfacing among the guests, hushed voices recalling old rumors, fragments of stories that suddenly didn't seem so absurd anymore. She was expelled from school once. "I heard her father paid off a family. Didn't someone say she ruined a man's career?" One by one, the secrets her family had hidden resurfaced, dragged out into the open like skeletons unearthed from shallow graves. My son stared at her, eyes burning not with anger anymore but with something worse, disappointment, the kind that cuts deeper than rage ever could. He shook his head slowly, backing away as if distance could cleanse him of the poison she had injected into his life. "Was any of it real?" he asked, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the crowd. "Did you ever love me? Or was this just another performance?" Her sobs grew louder, hysterical, almost feral. She reached for him, her manicured hands grasping at air, but he stepped back further, refusing her touch. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone, the wedding was not just ruined. The marriage was over before it had even begun. The bride's father stormed toward the exit, barking orders to his security detail, but they hesitated, uncertain, their loyalty wavering in the face of such public disgrace. His power, once absolute, was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. Meanwhile, the guests, hungry for every ounce of drama, began circling closer, their phones like weapons aimed at the fallen bride. It was a feeding frenzy, and in the center of it all, she knelt, broken, exposed, and utterly alone. I stood silently, my arms folded, watching it unfold with cold clarity. This wasn't just her downfall. This was the unraveling of an entire dynasty, and deep down I knew the worst was yet to come. The ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It had transformed into a battlefield of whispers, accusations, and unraveling lies. The chandelier's golden light no longer sparkled on silk dresses and polished shoes. It now exposed every tear-streaked face, every scowl of judgment, and every smirk of satisfaction. The bride knelt in the center of the chaos, her white gown pooling around her like a defeated flag. Her sobs had turned from grief to rage, sharp and jagged, filling the air like broken glass. She screamed at my son, at the groomsmen, at the guests, at anyone who dared look at her with pity or disgust. "Stop staring at me, stop it!" But no one stopped. Their eyes were locked on her, some hungry for gossip, others simply unable to look away from a tragedy unfolding in real time. Phones recorded from every angle, immortalizing her collapse for the entire world to see. Her father stormed back toward the center of the room, his face purple with fury. He raised his hand, not in violence but in command, as though sheer authority could silence the chaos. "This event is over," he roared. "Every single one of you, put those phones away and get out." But it was too late. His voice no longer carried power. His authority, once untouchable, had been shattered the moment his daughter's secret spilled into the open. Even the staff hesitated, looking not at him but at the guests who were still recording. Unwilling to cut off the drama, the groomsman stood tall now, his shame burned away, replaced with something like grim relief. "I won't carry her lies anymore," he said firmly, his voice carrying over the crowd. "She tricked all of us." "She tricked him," he pointed at my son, "and she tricked every single guest here tonight." The bride shrieked, lunging again, but her mother clutched her tightly, trying to hold her back, tears streaming down her face. "Please," her mother begged, "don't make it worse. Please, baby, stop." But worse was already here. Guests began murmuring more boldly now, their whispers turning into open accusations. "She destroyed my brother's engagement. She ruined my cousin's business deal. I warned her father years ago, she's dangerous." Every old rumor, every hushed story, every suspicion that had been swept under a rug came crawling back to life in that ballroom. It wasn't just the bride who was falling, it was her entire family. The father clenched his fists, his jaw tight, but I could see it in his eyes. Panic. The man who had built his reputation like a fortress was watching the walls crumble in front of hundreds of witnesses. And then my phone buzzed. I pulled it from my pocket, the glow illuminating the name on the screen. It was the number I had been saving for this very moment. Say a contact tied directly to the very foundations of the bride's father's empire. My son's eyes met mine, confusion and pain swirling within them. He mouthed, "Dad, what are you doing?" I didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, I slowly lifted the phone to my ear, the murmurs of the guests quieting as they noticed me. The bride's father froze mid-step, his gaze snapping toward me, realization dawning on his face. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling for the first time that night. "Oh, you wouldn't dare." I gave him a steady, cold look. "Watch me." The ballroom seemed to hold its breath as I spoke the words that would seal his downfall into the phone. "It's time. Release everything." A hush fell over the room, sharp and suffocating, as though the entire world had paused to hear what came next. The bride's father staggered, gripping the back of a chair to keep himself upright. His daughter's cries grew louder, almost animalistic, as though she sensed the storm I had just unleashed. The guests leaned in, eyes wide, phones recording every word, every gesture. This wasn't just a wedding ruined anymore. This was the destruction of a dynasty, and I was the one holding the match. The ballroom had fallen into a silence so tense it felt like the chandeliers themselves might shatter from the weight of it. My words, "release everything," still lingered in the air, echoing louder in the minds of the guests than the music ever had. Every camera phone pointed toward me now, capturing the moment where celebration had transformed into something darker, historic even. The bride's father, once the man who commanded every room with sheer presence, stumbled back as if I'd struck him. His eyes widened, a sheen of sweat forming on his forehead despite the chilled air from the grand hall's vents. He knew what I meant. He knew what was about to happen, and then, like a ripple in a pond, it began. First, one guest gasped. Then another's phone buzzed. Then, like a tidal wave, notifications poured into every hand holding a screen. News alerts, emails, posts, articles. The dam had broken. The corruption, the bribes, the secret deals, the betrayals, all the carefully buried sins of the bride's family, were flooding into the digital world in real time. Screens glowed across the ballroom as guests scrolled, jaws dropping, eyes darting between the glowing headlines and the crumbling man in front of them. CEO caught in multi-million-dollar fraud scandal. Political bribes linked to prominent businessmen exposed. Anonymous files reveal shocking truth about powerful family. The father tried to shout, tried to demand silence, but his voice cracked, lost in the rising tide of chaos. Guests no longer respected him. They no longer feared him. They only pitied, judged, and filmed. The bride let out a wail so sharp it pierced the room, clawing at her gown as if tearing the fabric could somehow rip her out of this reality. Her mother sank to her knees, covering her face with trembling hands. The family that once looked untouchable now looked like the centerpiece of a public execution. My son stood frozen, his world collapsing in ways he hadn't expected. But unlike the bride, he didn't rage. He didn't cry. He looked at me, eyes filled with shock, but beneath it, a flicker of relief. Relief that someone had finally taken control. The groomsman stepped forward, his voice trembling but firm. "It's all true," he said loudly, addressing the crowd. "Every word. They tried to silence me, but look, there it is, proof. They've ruined lives for years, and tonight they thought they could humiliate him." He pointed at me. But he had the courage to stand up. Gasps rippled. Some clapped. Others whispered furiously, but all of them believed. The father lurched toward me, face twisted with desperation. You've destroyed us." His voice broke. "Do you understand what you've done?" I met his gaze steadily, letting the weight of silence hang between us before answering. "No, you destroyed yourself. Tonight was just the unveiling." The bride collapsed, sobbing into her ruined dress. The guests began to file out, their chatter rising into a frenzy of speculation and disbelief. Phones were held high, videos streamed live, and by the time the doors swung open, the story had already spread far beyond the walls of that cursed ballroom. And there I stood, my phone still in hand. The quiet calm in the middle of the storm. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. Justice wrapped in humiliation, sealed with a phone call, delivered at the exact moment when their pride was highest, so that their fall would be the hardest. The music had stopped. The dancing had ended. The laughter was gone, but the story was just beginning to burn across the world. The wedding hall, once decorated with roses and silk, now looked like the aftermath of a battlefield. The tables were littered with untouched glasses of champagne, the dance floor lay abandoned, and the once proud family stood shattered like porcelain dolls dropped from a great height. But the chaos inside the ballroom was nothing compared to the storm brewing outside. By the time I stepped out into the night air, the world had already begun to feast on the story. News vans screeched to a halt outside the venue, their antennas stretching toward the sky like predators sniffing out prey. Paparazzi swarmed the entrance, their flashes igniting like fireworks, trying to catch a glimpse of the disgraced family as they stumbled into their waiting cars. Reporters barked questions with vicious glee. Is it true your company laundered money? Did you pay off government officials? Sir, how do you respond to the corruption allegations? The bride's father shoved past them, his once commanding stride reduced to a frantic stagger, face pale and slick with sweat. His wife clung to his arm, eyes hollow. Behind them, their daughter, the bride, was half carried, half dragged by friends, her sobs still echoing in the cold night air. Gone was the radiant bride of the morning. In her place was a broken figure, mascara smeared, veil torn, dignity obliterated. I watched from a distance, my hands tucked into my coat pockets. I wasn't smiling, but I wasn't grieving either. There was only stillness within me, like the silence after a thunderstorm. My son walked up beside me, his face pale under the streetlights. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he stared at the chaos unfolding before us. The reporters, the police cars pulling up, the guests scattering like startled birds. Finally he whispered, "Dad, what have you done?" I turned to look at him, studying his face. There was fear in his eyes, yes, but also something else, understanding. He had been humiliated by that family, manipulated into marrying their daughter, and tonight had shown him what they truly were. He just wasn't ready to admit it yet. I did what had to be done, I said quietly. Before he could respond, a reporter noticed me. Cameras swung in my direction, flashes blinding, voices shouting questions. "Sir, are you the father of the groom? Were you aware of the bride's family's corruption? Did you have a role in exposing them?" My son tensed, as though waiting for me to deny everything, to retreat into the shadows. But I didn't. I didn't raise my voice or make a scene. Instead, I simply met the cameras with a steady gaze and said, "The truth always comes out. Sometimes it just needs a little help." The words were calm, but they spread like gasoline meeting fire. Within minutes, my face was on live broadcasts, my statement replayed across social media, igniting speculation, debates, and applause from those who had suffered under the bride's father's empire. By the next morning, the fallout had exploded. Every major news channel led with the scandal. Anchors dissected the files, pointing out fraudulent deals, shady contracts, and decades of deceit. Hashtags trended worldwide, dragging the bride's family's name through the mud. Stock prices for their companies plummeted. Business partners severed ties overnight. Politicians who had once posed for photos with them scrambled to issue denials and condemnations. The bride's father, who had built his fortune on fear and silence, now had nowhere to hide. His empire wasn't crumbling, it was imploding. And the best part? None of it could be pinned on me. The information had been released anonymously, strategically and perfectly timed. I was just the man who had dialed the number. In the quiet of my home the next day, I sat at my kitchen table sipping coffee as the morning news replayed footage from the wedding. My son's face appeared, caught between anger and bewilderment. The bride's tear-streaked collapse filled the screen, the crowd's gasps echoing in the background. The anchors called it the wedding scandal of the decade. But for me, it wasn't just scandal, it was justice long overdue. By the second day after the wedding, the scandal had grown too big to contain. What began as whispers in a ballroom had erupted into a national firestorm. News outlets replayed the footage in endless loops. The bride's breakdown, The groomsman's accusations, and most damning of all, my calm words before making that single phone call. Outside the bride's family mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for the people. Corruption must fall. Your empire is built on lies." The gates that had once kept the world out now shook with the pounding of fists and the cries of angry voices. The family that had ruled with intimidation for decades now cowered behind drawn curtains. Security cameras captured every egg hurled at their pristine walls, every insult shouted into the night. Inside, their world collapsed even faster. Banks froze their accounts. Former allies withdrew support, issuing carefully worded statements about ethical concerns. Lawsuits piled up like mountains on their doorstep. Former employees, once too afraid to speak, now stepped forward with stories of exploitation, fraud, and betrayal. Each new revelation was another nail in the coffin of their legacy. The bride herself became the face of humiliation. Tabloid magazines plastered her crying face on covers with headlines like, "The Fall of the Princess Bride. From Wedding Bells to Scandal Hell. The Most Disgraced Bride in America." Clips of her shrieking at the wedding guests became viral memes, twisted into jokes, gifs, and parody videos. Social media tore her apart, dissecting her every past post, mocking her once luxurious lifestyle. For a woman who had lived her life basking in admiration and envy, this was the cruelest punishment imaginable. Public ridicule without escape. Her father fared no better. Reporters dug into his business empire, uncovering connections to shady shell companies, offshore accounts, and political bribes. Each revelation destroyed another piece of his reputation. Once hailed as a titan of industry, he was now a pariah, his face on front pages under bold red headlines. Fraud exposed. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves, each one claiming ignorance of his crimes. "We had no knowledge of these activities," they declared, even as photographs surfaced of them smiling at his galas, raising glasses of champagne with him. Their hypocrisy only fueled public outrage, and the fire spread wider. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed constantly with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Neighbors, old colleagues, even distant relatives. Some congratulated me for standing up to the family. Others begged me to share the inside story, but I ignored them all. I had no need for their praise. This wasn't about glory. It was about balance. I walked through the streets of my town and noticed the shift. Strangers who had once looked down on me for being just a father of the groom now nodded respectfully. Some whispered, "That's him." A grocery store clerk slipped an extra bag of apples into my cart with a smile. A mechanic refused to take payment for a quick repair, saying, "You've already done more for us than money can cover." Everywhere I went, the story followed. And while part of me wished for anonymity, another part of me knew this was bigger than me. My actions had pulled the first thread, and now the entire tapestry of corruption was unraveling. Back at home, my son avoided me. He hadn't called since the wedding night. I knew he was struggling to reconcile his shattered marriage, his public humiliation, and the fact that his own father had lit the match. I didn't blame him. He needed time, but I also knew he would one day see the truth. I hadn't just destroyed a wedding. I had freed him from a family that would have devoured him whole. On the third night, as I sat in my living room, the TV played yet another special report. The anchor's voice was grim. Authorities have confirmed investigations into the family's businesses, citing evidence of fraud and bribery. Arrests may follow in the coming days. The screen cut to footage of police cars parked outside the mansion. The bride's father stood in the doorway, shouting at reporters, his once polished image reduced to that of a desperate man clinging to the last remnants of control. And I realized this was only the beginning. By the end of the week, the collapse of the bride's family empire was undeniable. What had taken decades to build unraveled in a matter of days, each headline striking another blow. The FBI raided their corporate offices at dawn, cameras capturing the scene live as agents carried out boxes of files and hard drives. Newscasters spoke in hushed, urgent tones. This is the largest corporate scandal in the region in over 20 years. Helicopters hovered overhead as investigators carted away evidence, while employees, faces pale, eyes downcast, were escorted out under the flashing lights of news crews. The bride's father tried to issue a statement, standing before microphones, sweat glistening on his forehead as he insisted, These are lies, smears. I built everything honestly. But the microphones were drowned out by reporters shouting questions, their voices sharp as arrows. What about the offshore accounts? Why were you meeting with government officials behind closed doors? Do you deny bribery charges? He faltered, and in that moment the image of power he had carried for so long shattered. So he wasn't a titan anymore. He was just a man caught in his own web. The bride, meanwhile, had disappeared from public view. Some claimed she had fled to a private villa. Others said she was locked away in the mansion, refusing to eat, screaming at anyone who mentioned her ruined wedding. Her once loyal bridesmaids were now posting cryptic messages online, thinly veiled jabs at her arrogance, her cruelty, her lies, and through it all, my name remained unspoken publicly, but whispered in the background. People speculated who had triggered the downfall, who had dared to light the fire. Those who knew me quietly spread the truth. It had been me, the father of the groom, the man who had been humiliated but refused to bow. But inside my own home, the fallout was more complicated. On the 5th night after the wedding, my son finally came. I found him sitting in my kitchen, hunched over the table, his hands clenched together so tightly his knuckles were white. His eyes were red, not from anger but from sleepless nights. "You destroyed them," he said quietly. His voice wasn't filled with accusation but with disbelief. I sat down across from him, waiting. "You?" he struggled, shaking his head. "Do you even realize what you did? My marriage is over. My wife hates me. Her family," he trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "Her family is being torn apart on the news every hour. Everyone's laughing. Everyone's pointing." I met his gaze, steady and calm. "Do you really think you would have been happy married into that family?" He flinched, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter. It was my marriage, my life. You didn't give me a choice, Dad." For a moment his words cut deep. He was right, I had acted, not asked. But I hadn't needed his permission. I had seen the truth he refused to face, and I had acted before they could destroy him completely. "They humiliated me," I said, my voice firm but not raised. "They humiliated you. They would have used you until you were nothing, and then tossed you aside like garbage. I didn't ruin your marriage, son. I saved you from it." He looked at me, torn between fury and understanding. His lips parted as if to argue, but then he stopped. His shoulders sagged. He buried his face in his hands. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he whispered. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I reached across the table, placing my hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to forgive me. Not now, maybe not ever. But one day you'll see what I saw. And when that day comes, you'll understand why I did it." Silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the world continued to feast on the scandal. But here in this room, it was just a father and a son, caught between destruction and salvation. Finally, my son stood, his eyes glassy with unspoken words. "I need time," he said, his voice breaking. Then he walked out, leaving the door to close softly behind him. I sat there alone, my coffee growing cold, my heart heavy yet resolute, because I knew, whether he understood it today or years from now, I had done what needed to be done. The empire of lies had fallen. My son was free, and I was willing to carry the weight of his anger, if it meant he would never again be shackled to people like them. The collapse wasn't just financial, it was absolute. By the end of the second week, the bride's family name had become a national scandal. Headlines screamed across newspapers, talk show hosts dissected every detail of their corruption, and late-night comedians mocked them mercilessly. Once the bride's father was invited to banquets and charity galas. Now his face appeared in mugshots on primetime news. The mansion that had been lit up with chandeliers during the wedding was now swarmed with reporters, their cameras flashing through the gates, waiting for a glimpse of the fallen king. Guards stood at the driveway, not to keep people out, but to prevent the desperate family from sneaking away unseen. The bride herself had become a spectacle. Leaked recordings of her tantrums spread online, her screaming at servants, smashing plates, blaming everyone but herself. Social media turned her into a meme, a cruel but fitting punishment for someone who had once laughed at my cheap suit and dismissed me as unworthy of respect. Even her closest friends abandoned her. Influencers who had once filled her wedding with fake smiles now posted captions like, "Karma always wins." Hashtags trended. The internet tore her apart faster than any scandal ever could, and the father, the great businessman, the titan, was finally indicted. Cameras captured the moment when agents placed him in handcuffs, his head bowed, his pride stripped away. For a man who had commanded boardrooms, who had humiliated me in front of hundreds, his downfall was poetic. I watched all of this unfold quietly from my living room, the television casting blue light across my face. My phone buzzed constantly, calls, messages, requests for interviews, but I ignored them all. I had no interest in fame, no desire for credit. My revenge was complete the moment I saw the arrogance drained from their eyes. But revenge, I realized, didn't taste sweet. It was heavy, like lead in my chest. That evening I walked to the small park near my house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. Children laughed in the distance, their voices free of the weight that burdened my shoulders. I sat on a bench, breathing in the cool air, feeling the world around me moving forward while my own life remained suspended in the shadow of what I'd done. My son hadn't returned since our conversation. I knew he was struggling, torn between loyalty to me and the grief of his shattered marriage. Perhaps he would hate me forever. Perhaps one day he would see me as the man who had protected him when he was too blinded by love to see the truth. But whether forgiveness came or not, I had made peace with my choice. The bride's family would never rise again. Their empire was ash, their reputation ruined. They had mocked me for being less than, and now they were the ones who had been reduced to nothing. I stood from the bench, my hands tucked into my coat pockets. The park lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the path. I walked slowly, each step echoing in the silence of the evening. For the world, this was a scandal. For me, it was simply the end of a chapter. I didn't need applause. I didn't need acknowledgement. I had my dignity, my truth, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when I was pushed to the edge, I did not break. I had struck back. And the world would remember the fall, even if they never knew the hand that had tipped the first domino. With that, I left the park, my figure swallowed by the night, carrying nothing but the silence of a man who had fought his battle and won. I want to pause and ask you something important. If you were in my place, humiliated by your own family in front of hundreds, would you have stayed silent or would you have taken action the way I did? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments, because I truly want to know how people from different countries and cultures see this. And while you're here, let me know your country and the time you're watching this story. It always amazes me to see this community connecting across the world. If this story shook you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because trust me, the next story will be even more shocking. Every week, I share real, raw tales filled with betrayal, revenge, heartbreak, and redemption. Stories that could happen to any of us, but not everyone has the courage to tell. Don't just watch, be part of this journey. Your voice matters, your opinion matters. Let's grow this community together.